This video examines safety in the workplace, from the Industrial Revolution up to the modern era, and illustrates how the creation of the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration has helped protect American workers. This topic is an important subject of study for anyone venturing into the field of business management and human resource management, because it is imperative to know the moral and legal requirements involved when staffing and managing a workforce. One of the chief functions of OSHA is to promote safety through federally mandated safety training programs. A few of these programs, along with their impacts, will be examined later. But first, we should take a brief look at the history of safety in the United States. Despite modern perceptions to the contrary, safety in the workplace is a relatively recent concept, having only come about in the last 150 years or so. Only since the latter part of the 19th century has safety become a principal concern for American workers. Up until that point, little regard was paid to workers' health and safety, due to the social, legal, and technological climate that existed in those times. Back when our forefathers broke ties with England and settled on this continent, the landscape was essentially a pristine wilderness, and most of the work done in the New World consisted of clearing the land for farming. Thus, the labor market was primarily agricultural, people growing crops to survive. However, the land possessed an abundance of raw natural resources, and it did not take long for people to begin to capitalize on these resources. Within a short span of time, the United States began to pioneer the Industrial Revolution. Colonists incorporated better farming methods and improvements in technology to enhance the productivity of their crops. Then they began to build factories to process the raw materials. With the advent of the factory system, American labor began to shift from the agricultural realm to the manufacturing realm. As technological advances in agricultural machinery reduced the physical demands of labor in the fields, more and more men began to work inside factories, transforming raw materials into products. However, the factory system was owner-oriented, driven by the new principles of capitalism, and the safety of workers was not taken into account. Working conditions were harsh, to say the least, and workers experienced degrees of dangers and hardships unknown to modern times. Workers routinely worked a dozen hours or more a day. Factories had no heating or cooling, and catastrophic industrial accidents were common. By the year 1900, industrial accidents killed 35,000 workers a year and maimed 500,000 others, and those numbers continued to rise. The early factory system developed within a legal and regulatory framework that minimized the owner's interest in safety, focusing purely on generating profits and products instead. Even when workers were killed or maimed, the courts categorically sided with factory owners in holding that the workers were not entitled to any recourse. Even on the rare occasions when a worker did manage to prevail in the courts, their average compensation amounted to only about a half a year's pay. In other words, the cost of accidents was so cheap that the American manufacturing industry held little regard for safety. Within this background, a growing movement began to emerge. Workers demanded safer working conditions. Banding together in solidarity, they formed labor unions in the vein of Marxist socialism, believing in the power of collective bargaining. Beginning in the 1800s, labor unions began to spring up in the United States in various industries, especially among the mining, railway, steel, and industrial workers. After suffering years of hardships, conditions for American workers slowly started to improve, and in the wake of the Great Depression, the federal government began to take action on behalf of workers. Beginning with the passage of the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, Congress finally enacted federal legislation aimed at protecting the rights of workers. Other legislations quickly followed, including the Walsh-Healy Act of 1936, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, and the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. These bills brought sweeping changes to the labor relations landscape within the United States, establishing federal agencies to monitor labor practices, creating legal avenues for workers to hold companies liable for hazardous working conditions, and creating civil penalties that the government could levy against company owners in the event of noncompliance. Eventually, the prevailing mindset began to change, as businesses, workers, unions, courts, and the government came to see that safety in the workplace was in the best interest of everyone involved. The culmination in the thrust for workplace safety came with the passage of the landmark Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, which created the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, a federal oversight agency that governs and monitors health and safety within the private sector and the federal government. According to its website, OSHA's mission is to assure safe and healthful workplaces by setting and enforcing standards, and by providing training, outreach, education, and assistance to assist employers in keeping their workplace free of recognized hazards. The effects of the OSHA Act on safety in the workplace were made manifest rather quickly. In the first decade after its passage, workplace fatalities decreased 28% and work-related product deaths in the home fell by 9%. In the 4 decades since OSHA's passage, fatality rates have fallen from 18 per 100,000 employees to 3.8 per 100,000 employees. Even though statistics are often suspect, in this case it appears clear that the measures have had a significant impact on the lives and safety of employees. OSHA not only collects data on job site injuries, but also tries to actively prevent them. Part of OSHA's mission is to educate workers in regards to safety, bring awareness to potential dangers, and provide training programs for both employers and employees. Many of the standards and protocols implemented by OSHA require employers to train employees in the health and safety aspects of their jobs, and Congress has empowered OSHA with the legal authority to compel employers to abide by these regulations, and fines and penalties for non-compliance can be quite hefty. For example, in January 2016, a Framingham, Massachusetts contractor was fined $188,000 for 16 violations as a result of a surprise job site inspection. Because of the huge monetary penalties involved, most employers make every effort to stay abreast of OSHA regulations and train their workforces accordingly. Certain employees may receive some specialized training depending on the specific nature of their jobs, but most workers are given generalized training as part of the job orientation process. OSHA usually requires employees who are engaging in industry and manufacturing to be trained in 5 core safety areas: hazardous materials exposure and handling, personal protective equipment, the Focus 4 hazards, struck by, caught by, falls, and electrocution, ergonomics, and emergency action plans. First, let's look at hazardous materials exposure and handling. In the past, prior to the OSHA Act, workers were regularly exposed to all types of substances and chemicals in the workplace, often with serious health consequences. As a result, OSHA takes hazardous materials exposure seriously and mandates strict training and awareness on proper handling of environmental hazards. As late as the 1970s, when the OSHA Act was created, it was not uncommon for workers to be exposed to chemicals such as lead, ammonia, benzene, asbestos, and formaldehyde. Now, with OSHA regulations in place, workers are no longer subjected to these types of biohazards. Workers now have the right to know which substances they may be exposed to on site through OSHA-mandated material safety data sheets, and must be trained in the handling of these materials and have access to a written hazard communication program. These measures, along with countless civil judgments, have reduced worker exposure levels in the past several decades. Now let's look at personal protective equipment. In virtually every industrial manufacturing operation, there is almost always some type of inherent risk associated with the job, simply because engineering and administrative controls cannot eliminate every conceivable hazard. For this reason, OSHA mandates that companies furnish employees with personal protective equipment. Personal protective equipment is worn to minimize the risk of exposure or injury from various dangers. Examples of PPE include items such as gloves, steel-toed shoes, eye protection, earplugs, and respirators. OSHA requires employers to conduct hazard assessments and issue protective equipment for any dangers found. It should be allocated as needed to minimize the level of risk associated with each particular job. In keeping with OSHA's protective equipment mandates, protective eyeglasses are now worn in almost every factory in America, and although still high, the number of work-related eye injuries has decreased. Likewise, the increased use of earplugs, respirators, and other safety equipment have all contributed to similar decreases in overall injury rates among many types of industries. Now, let's look at the Focus 4 hazards. OSHA has identified 4 types of accidents that jointly account for the majority of all work-related fatalities in the manufacturing and construction industries. These are struck by, caught between, falls, and electrocution accidents. Collectively, these accidents are called the Focus 4, and OSHA mandates training on these topics to bring awareness to them and to help promote prevention. The dangers of the Focus 4 categories are unfortunately all too real. In 2010, 402 workers were killed and struck by accidents. In 2008, 98 workers were killed by caught between accidents. Between 150 and 200 workers are killed annually, and over 100,000 are injured as a result of falls, and an average of 143 workers are killed yearly by electrocution while working. In addition to safety training, OSHA now offers many Focus 4 resources for employers and employees in an effort to help mitigate these types of injuries and fatalities. The fourth category is ergonomics. Not all hazards to workers involve catastrophic injury or death. Some hazards are more insidious in nature and manifest slowly over longer periods of time. Some hazards lead to musculoskeletal disorders, and one of the leading causes of these disorders are repetitive stress injuries, such as carpal tunnel syndrome, tendinitis, rotator cuff injuries, back problems, and muscle sprains. These injuries stem from lifting, bending, reaching, pushing, and pulling, or from performing repetitive tasks daily, and are among the most common reported causes of lost or restricted work time. As such, OSHA also sets standards governing ergonomics in the workplace to study how workers interact with their environment and help identify and eliminate these hazards using engineering and administrative controls. Lastly, we have emergency action plans. Ordinarily, companies across America function day to day under normal operating procedures, without any major incidents, and all is well. But every now and then, due to an unforeseen twist of fate, something unexpected will happen, and everything can go horribly wrong. From time to time, work sites have to be locked down or evacuated due to everything from fires, explosions, tornadoes, contamination, civil disturbance, and violence. When this happens, companies must be ready to deal with the crisis. The EAP not only covers evacuation procedures, including routes and exits, but also contains information on how to account for employees afterwards, contacting the appropriate authorities, securing the scene, and perhaps preserving evidence for any subsequent investigations. A well-planned, well-organized, and well-executed emergency action plan increases the safety and security of everyone on site, and it should be included in all standard safety training programs. In conclusion, as illustrated by the foregoing, the rights of workers and the conceptualization of safety in the workplace have taken great leaps forward. From its humble beginnings in the factory system days during the Industrial Revolution, all the way to today's safety-driven management philosophies, the attitude toward safety has gradually evolved to make the workplace as safe as possible. Some of that progress stemmed from technological and intellectual advances that brought about awareness and solutions to problems, but many of the advances have come about as a direct result of the OSHA Act. In the 4 decades since its passage, there has been a dramatic impact on workplace safety. Worker deaths in America are down, on average, from 14,000 deaths per year in 1970 to 4,400 deaths per year in 2014, a decrease of 60%. And OSHA's mandatory safety training programs, coupled with rigorous administrative enforcement, have been the driving forces behind this trend. Familiarity with OSHA's mandates and safety regulations is crucial knowledge for human resource managers, administrators, and anyone involved in the staffing and managing of manufacturing or industrial companies, because the government demands strict compliance with its guidelines. A successful health and safety program requires highly effective human resource management and should be instituted from a top-down perspective, beginning with all top management personnel and filtering down to workers on the floor. Selective staffing plays a key role in the program's success, and larger companies usually have at least one corporate safety officer and sometimes even a team of safety officers to oversee safety at the job site. Many companies fear OSHA inspections the way drivers fear traffic stops, with the overwhelming sense of dread. However, OSHA's mission is not to penalize businesses, but to make workers safer. Whether people agree or disagree with OSHA's regulations or mandatory training programs is beside the point, for no one can dispute their results. Simply stated, OSHA saves lives. No one knows exactly how many injuries and deaths have been prevented as a result of these policies, but what is clear is that heading off to work now, it is a lot safer than it used to be.